Hi there. In this lecture, I'm going to discuss DNA and the role that it plays in this theory, and I'm going to discuss how an understanding of DNA will help design the thinking machine. Um, so, in traditional texts, you're going to see DNA described in terms of these two spirals that interlock, and you know they have a variety of binding mechanisms to each other, and there's chromosomes, and in them is the genetic code that details how to build a living organism. So without going, there's no need for me to go into it in huge detail because A, I'm not an expert, and B, the point is not to describe DNA, but is to figure out at a high level what it does and how can we take advantage of the design pattern that's there, uh, and then also try and kind of really understand what it's doing. So, in its simplest terms, what we have in a living being is a physical copy, according to this theory, and a virtual copy. So, the two the two parts of the being, the physical and the virtual, are basically encoded in the DNA, and there's a messaging protocol, and there's apps, and there's cell types. So we can build a body that processes sound, where we hear things. We can process color. We can reproduce and pass on this program, this DNA based program, to the next generation, which will over time evolve into different forms. Um, the other thing that's kind of important is that the visual system that we have, as I'll show later when I talk about the vision system, it's very sophisticated. It's I think something like 1/3 and more of the brain is dedicated just to vision and understanding vision. But what comes out of it, as I'll explain later, is the ability to model objects and to attach semantic information to them. And this is part of what the DNA can build, is a brain which can process vision. Um, I won't go into it in too much detail here. So what we're trying to do, instead of me saying, well, DNA was discovered at a particular point in time by certain people and it's been mapped and all that history, that a person can find that up by just doing simple search and getting to the core story behind it. What I'm trying to do here is ask, what is it that it does. So what I'm going to try and do is reverse engineer DNA into sort of the high level components of it, as opposed to the specifics of how a cell reproduces. So cell reproduction itself is a fascinating topic, and there's some really great videos out there on it. But what one sees if one researches it is, when DNA copies itself, there's a lot of checks and balances that go on there in the process of copying, and and it's very sophisticated. But if we're designing an android or a thinking machine, we don't need to get too caught up in the details of the checks and balances of how does one cell copy another cell and make sure it doesn't make mistakes. Mostly that's a pretty low level operation from a software engineering viewpoint. There do have to be checks and balances done, but they're low level. So we're gonna sit above that level. Uh, so that's kind of where the idea is. Um, the idea is not just to copy DNA and say, wow, we got to really just copy how DNA works. What we're going to try and do here is take the design and improve upon it. And as I've said in the document, that's not easy to do. This has been this program or evolutionary design has been refined over millions of years, and there's a huge amount of detail in the different aspects of DNA that one would need to kind of really study deeply, and you could probably spend a career just focusing on little pieces of it. But the idea would be, let's just take a look at DNA at a high level and see, is there anything we can improve upon it. Now, one of the other things that DNA does for us is, when it builds our bodies, is it gives us a central nervous system, and basically this central nervous system um, sits inside our core structure. Most living beings, I think pretty much all of them, uh, have some kind of a nervous system. And so when I talk about the physical person versus the virtual person, what you have is a physical structure, which is your body, as is obvious. But inside that are all these sensors, and we're going to delve in this series of video documentaries, or these audio documentaries with the video component. We're going to delve into all the different aspects of what it is to be a human being, and what is it the DNA is building up that kind of constitutes what we are. So one of the things it builds up is builds up this central nervous system. So this all the messages. So then we start getting into the concept of the messaging system. So if you see a picture of a nervous system, I see a central messaging system. So lots of messages going to the brain centers where all that information can be processed. Okay, and in the brain there is this virtual version of us, which is constantly being fed information about our physical body. So there's the syncing up the physical body with the virtual body. I do have a diagram, a very very basic diagram. I do have a very basic diagram that I'll see can I find here, and just to kind of I will update this in later lectures, but the basic idea is to try and capture. This was one of my very first diagrams, so it's very very rough. But the basic idea is you have reality, and you have a person in it, and you have some object like say a tree. It doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter what it is. And then what you have is the virtual kind of person inside the physical person. They're one and the same. And the body that one lives in takes the tree, processes it through some abstraction mechanism, whatever it is, through various senses, which I'll detail later. And then the virtual person, which is ourselves, can see that tree, can go and touch it, and interact with the tree, and it's basically a virtual copy of what we're seeing. But the idea of an evolved being is that those two experiences become seamless. So later I'll talk about what happens when that goes wrong, and then the illnesses that people suffer from, and the strange dislocation that they experience. But the basic idea is there's a synchronization process that happens between what's really going on in the world versus what's going on inside your body, and how your body is creating that illusion and making it as real and as consistent as possible with the external reality. So that's the idea. Okay, so I'll go back down. So we have the central nervous system, which is built by the DNA, and um, again, with you'll see this in any medical text. Um, see this in any medical text. I just lost my way here. 1 second. So I'll just get back to where I should be. But the basic idea is that system gives us our initial sense of um, self through these messages that are passed along our nerve endings. Okay, here we go. Here we go. So there we're back again. So that's our nervous system. And then I go down. So the question that one asks initially is, where does the virtual copy live? Now, so if I talk about there being a virtual person and a physical person, if you're talking to a person, you're going to say, well, no, it's just one thing, right? But if you're trying to replicate this system in a machine or in some kind of object, our brains have to somehow produce that, process those messages, and have to synchronize them and give us that sense of reality of what this place is. So, so there's different parts of the brain. So we start off then in terms of trying to understand what it is that the brain is doing. So the brain is uh, the brain is like, we've sent men to the moon, we've sent some people to the bottom of the oceans, but the brain is kind of, there is a lot of research as I speak going on about the brain, and I've done some research on it. And what seems to be happening there is you have a lot of people researching different aspects of the brain. Uh, so what I'll do here is I will just take the viewpoint of, I'm no brain expert, but what I'll do is I'll talk about the basic ideas of the brain, in terms of taking a look at it in terms of trying to design um, taking a look at it in terms of trying to design a thinking machine. So the idea is our DNA has built this body that we live in, and it's given us a sense of reality. We have a virtual copy and a physical copy, and the virtual copy lives in here somewhere. It's a combination of all these components. So this is your spinal cord, and this is the old part of the brain, and this is the newer part of the brain that's mammalian, and that basically constitutes what we are. But basically, later I'm going to describe where I think the virtual copy lives, and how it works. But it requires a certain degree of having to examine how the brain works. So, and then we enter the world, the medical worlds, where they have all these um, fantastic terms for all the different parts of the brain. You've got the medulla oblongata, you've the midbrain, the cerebral hemisphere, the pons, and so on. If you're a medical person, this is all pretty obvious stuff. If you're maybe a computer science person, maybe not so obvious. So this is the newer part of the brain. This is the older part of the brain, and then this has evolved over time. So this is the thalamus here. So as we move forward, I'm going to talk a heck of a lot about um, uh, the parts of the brain that I think are processing all the messaging that comes in. So where the messaging comes into the brain and is aggregated is where, according to this theory, is the kind of the message centers of the brain. And I'm going to talk about the circuitry in the brain and the different aspects of the brain that process different components of what we are, who we are, and how it creates what our sense of self. So mostly this area here is going to be, I'm going to talk about this area here mostly about, in terms of the kind of our sense of consciousness, our sense of self. But the idea being that I'm going to say this is where the main messaging centers are, and from there there's a variety of techniques the brain uses to create our sense of self. Now this theory, if you try to research this stuff on the net, there really isn't a book like this out there. So this is my own theory. If I get it wrong, uh, it's on me. But I'm just going to talk you through how I see it working, and if I get it wrong, then I do. But the idea is not necessarily to reverse engineer people. It's more to say, this is how I think it's working, and this is how a machine should work in this way. So it doesn't have to be 100% correct, because I'm not reverse engineering the human body. I'm trying to kind of come up with a design pattern that seems to make sense, that could be used in a machine type solution. So even if I get it a little bit wrong, or maybe I use the wrong term here and there, it's kind of not really that important, in terms of just trying to kind of build up this picture of what it is our brain does. But I see the brain in this theory as a messaging system. It has what I call apps switched on and off in certain cells, and there's different techniques used to combine messages to achieve certain results and so on. All right, so that's the idea. So that's your brain picture. Um, so then I talk a little bit here about lack of coordination and being athletic, and I talk about the coordinating the physical with the virtual, and if the two are out of sync, then that can cause you, maybe you can be kind of what people might say, um, someone who maybe needs to be helped to improve their coordination. Um, and then I talk here about the structure of a person versus the messaging, and so there's the physicality of people, and then there's the messaging side. So a human being isn't just a pure messaging system. A human being has a body. So let's talk about next it's neurons. Let's talk about the neurons. So the neurons are basically in the brain. This is all part of the neural net theory. So what we talk about in this chapter is the mechanism by which a human being in their brains interconnect uh, one neuron to another, and from there generate certain kind of intelligence, demonstrated intelligence. So I'm going to take a look at a neuron in terms of, like, I'm going to say it's a message passing system, right? So people will call it a neuron. I'm going to call it like a neuron, but I'm going to say implicitly it's storing messages. It's taking messages in through the dendrites, and then it's processing them in the nucleus using some kind of, dare I say it, a bit, some kind of business logic or cell logic. In other words, it's specialized to do a particular function, and depending on the kind of the inputs, and I'll talk about this later because there's different types of neurons. It does some kind of operation in here, and then the results get sent down these myelin sheets, as they're called, and then they get sent out to one or more uh, transmitters. So this is like a receiver. This is the bit that processes the message, and this is the bit that transmits it to another location. And so this is the physicality part. This is how the brain kind of. So some of these myelin sheets are very long. So, for example, in the spine, they can be quite long. In the brain, some of them can be shorter. So these. So think of it as something taking in messages, processing a message, and then sending a result out to one or more other locations. That's the way a neuron is seen in this theory. Messages in, processed, messages out. Okay, in its simplest term. Obviously, there's a lot more detail than that in reality, but that's the basic concept. Um, then we talk about the DNA and RNA, and the basic idea is that the RNA is responsible for the mechanism by which the cell itself is built. It's like a blueprint. And then I talk next here about actors. Now, this is where we kind of jump from the idea of this is where we jump from the idea of software engineering, or from bioengineering into software engineering. And there is a concept in software called the actor model, and it's not nothing to do with Hollywood. This is to do with a self-contained cell that knows how to behave in a particular way. So it's it's what's called ACA, but it's used in a kind of a distributed messaging system. So in a distributed messaging system, you have a cell, in this case a human cell of some kind, specialized to do a particular operation, and mostly it takes in messages and processes them, and it sends out results. So you think of the cell as an actor, and it has a specific role to handle. So a bit like an atom, like an atom in physics, it knows what it does. And you've got the table of contents of the atoms, the hydrogens and the heliums, and you could think of each of them as an actor, and each of them has its own power source, its own energy. It has its own set of behaviors. So a cell can be thought of like an atom, and then an actor can be thought of as a software copy of a cell, or saying even an atom, where it just takes in messages, it processes those messages, and it sends out results. and we'll see later that this is kind of what cells are doing in a human body. It's a simplified model, and I know there's a lot more detail to it, but that's the basic idea here. So this is what we're trying to model. So we have then the physical and the virtual copy, and then then I start kind of at a high level start talking about the kind of messages that need to be passed around and their semantic meaning. Um, and I kind of use this uppercase notation here to kind of describe like a message. So messages need to know what the time is, how old they are. Cells need to know how old they are, and so on. And I kind of create this kind of pseudo kind of messages. Initially, I'm just formulating just at a high level what the messages could look like. This is the system time, this is my time, this is what I do, this is the cell, these are the messages I send, these are the messages I receive, this is how when I replicate, this is how I finish. So cells kind of know stuff like that. So these are the actors. A bit like an actor on a stage. You say you are going to be character X, and they go, and then they say, well, what do I? So then, by knowing who they are, they can say, okay, in this situation, I behave this way. A bit like a cell in a body. You are a skin cell. You sit here. This is how you reproduce another one. These are the messages you get in, and so on. So that's the idea. Pretty simple. Another important concept in this document is, I talk about a human being comprised of messages and message passing, and I say, oh, that's the key to intelligence, and maybe it's not terribly obvious why that is the case. So later I describe the way uh, say ants work. I explain that ants have like two chromosomes and they have very simple messaging in their bodies. And individually, an ant isn't intelligent, but we know that ant colonies are highly intelligent. So I think the analogy is the ants have distributed the messaging amongst themselves. So later on, I'll explain how an ant colony can, like, you can pour ants out of a cup and they'll all cling together and they'll build bridges together and so on. And the idea is that a human being who is considered intelligent has basically consolidated that messaging inside their bodies, whereas an ant would have distributed the messaging. And then I talk about how do they notify each other of what their intent is, and therefore then as a group they exhibit intelligence, but individually they don't. And then a human being has much more sophisticated messaging, therefore a human being is therefore more intelligent. So basically, if one sees messaging as the key to intelligence, the ant model is an example of how one can describe intelligence in group behavior versus, say, a very smart a human being, and we say they have a high IQ, which means in this theory they have a very good messaging, a very sophisticated messaging system in their brain, combined with certain abilities. I talk about an onion model where we protect the core of the brain. I've shown that in the diagram. The central part of the brain is where the virtual system is. And then I talk about chromosomes and how they change and so on, which is the Darwinian thing. And then I talk about how DNA must really know things like if you're going to build a virtual person. So the idea is, if you have a virtual and a physical person, the DNA needs to know what you physically look like almost like one of these sci-fi holograms where the little person appears. The DNA inside it knows what the person's going to look like in order to sync up the body with it. That's according to this theory. I know some people might not agree with that, but that's the theory. So then you've got like there's system conscious messaging to system messaging. So I talk about how here in this section how a person basically might feel thirsty, and how that message comes from your HOS. If you're not sure what HOS is, just look at the earlier overview where I described the terms, and then you get a HOS message saying water's low, and then you suddenly say to someone, "Oh, I'm thirsty." So there's the message passing um, uh, works there. Um, I then kind of also talk about whether an android needs this kind of approach, and well, for the most part, it does. I don't think there's really many cases where the human behavior is not really needed for a machine behavior. I mean, if a human being says I'm thirsty, then it kind of makes sense that if a android is low or a machine is low on energy, it notifies you, and that's what most PCs do. Um, so this, I talk about dynamic messaging here. Um, okay, and then so that's it really. So that's the end of the chapter. So I guess the core of this approach is to think about DNA in terms of building these cell types, which can be thought of as actors, which take in certain messages. They know what they do. They know what their age is, and they know what they need. They know how to replicate, and so on. And then the brain and the body is a giant messaging system with a virtual and a physical structure. That's it for this lecture.